Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today our mission is to take a comprehensive academic look at a truly fascinating endogenous compound, palmitoylethanolamide, or PEA.
And we're doing this deep dive specifically guided by a detailed thesis that examines PEA's biological mechanisms and its potential therapeutic applications. We're particularly focusing, as the source does, on its role in sensory systems, that's eyesight, hearing, and olfaction, alongside its impact on respiratory inflammation.
Exactly. For you, our listener, who needs the full granular picture, the how and the why, just like you'd expect from a thorough academic review, our goal is to extract the most important detailed insights from this source material. We want to give you the data, the mechanisms, and a critical look at the evidence as presented in this academic work.
So let's jump right in. Let's unpack the fundamental nature of PEA. What exactly is this molecule?
All right, starting with the basics. What is PEA? The source defines it as an endogenous fatty acid amide. It's part of a family of signaling molecules known as N-acylethanolamines, or NAEs for short.
Right, NAEs. And as the source points out, this isn't a completely new discovery, is it? Its history actually dates back to, 1957?
That's right, 1957. First isolated from natural sources like soybean lecithin, egg yolk, and peanut meal.
And even back then, those early reports hinted at anti-inflammatory properties. Later on, of course, its presence in mammalian tissues was confirmed, which established it as something our own bodies naturally produce, endogenous.
So it's present in both some dietary sources and in our own tissues. And chemically, what are we looking at? Can you break that down a bit?
Sure. Chemically, it's N2-hydroxyethylpalmitamide. So that tells us it's derived from palmitic acid, a very common saturated fatty acid, and ethanolamine. It's essentially a lipid molecule, a fatty substance, which is really important for its properties and how it interacts within the body.
Okay, so an endogenous lipid molecule found naturally in us and some foods with these early hints of anti-inflammatory effects. That brings us to a crucial aspect highlighted by the source. Its endogenous significance, this idea that it's synthesized on cellular demand. What are the clinical implications of that specific point?
This is pivotal, really central to understanding PEA. Unlike many other signaling molecules that are, stored up in vesicles and then released when triggered, PEA is synthesized de novo. That means it's made right there within the lipid bilayer of cell membranes when needed.
Not stored. Made fresh, essentially.
Exactly. It's not stored in large quantities. Its production is primarily triggered as part of the body's innate protective mechanism. Think cellular injury, stress, or specific disease conditions, that's when production ramps up.
So it's like the body's localized, on-the-spot response agent, a first responder at the cellular level.
Precisely. That's a great way to put it. It's found in nearly all human tissues, which reflects its widespread potential role in just maintaining cellular health. But its production increases dramatically under conditions of cellular stress or pathology. This on-demand synthesis is highly indicative of a dynamic homeostatic role.
Homeostatic. So maintaining balance.
Yes, modulating local tissue equilibrium and augmenting natural protective responses directly at the site where the problem is occurring. This makes it quite different from, say, a continuously active systemic signaling molecule that's always present at high levels throughout the body. PEA's action is much more targeted and responsive.
That localized responsive action seems absolutely fundamental to its function. And while it's endogenous, we touched on dietary sources. Do those foods we eat, egg yolks, peanuts, contribute significantly to our systemic levels? Is that a major factor?
Well, while PEA is found in those foods, egg yolks, peanuts, soybeans, even palm oil, the amounts can vary quite a bit, and it's not typically considered a primary way to achieve, therapeutic levels needed for significant clinical effects. As the source mentions, commercially available PEA supplements are often synthetic, and the therapeutic focus is generally on providing exogenous PEA, usually in optimized forms, to either bolster the body's own response or provide a direct therapeutic effect beyond what diet alone could achieve.
Got it. So made on demand during injury, not stored. Production spikes where needed. This leads directly into its classification as an aliomide. The source gives credit to Nobel laureate Rita Levi-Montalcini for her significant work in advancing this concept. Could you define an aliomide for us and explain why this classification is so important?
Sure. Aliomide stands for autacoid local injury antagonist. Let's break that down. An autacoid is basically a substance that acts locally, often produced and acting within the same tissue. So an aliomide, in the case of PEA, is a compound synthesized locally right there in response to tissue injury or inflammation. And its function is specifically to counteract these events at their site of origin.
So it's literally an antagonist to local injury processes. That local action feels key, really central to the whole idea.
It is absolutely pivotal, crucial to its physiological role and, importantly, its therapeutic potential. The source notes that PEA levels are observed to fluctuate. They go up and down with cell damage, inflammation, and pain across various species. This strongly supports its role as a responsive local modulator.
And how does this aliomide concept influence how we should think about using exogenous PEA supplementation in clinical practice? Does it change how we might expect it to work?
It has significant implications. The aliomide concept suggests that supplementing with PEA, especially in its optimized forms, might preferentially augment the body's natural responses in tissues that are already damaged or inflamed.
So it goes where the action is already happening.
Exactly. It targets the areas where endogenous PEA production is likely already upregulated and needed most. This potentially targeted action, focusing on the specific tissues involved in pathology, could contribute significantly to its generally favorable side effect profile. Think about it compared to traditional systemic drugs that might affect healthy tissues more broadly.
Right, because healthy tissues might have lower PEA turnover.
Precisely. Healthy tissues with lower baseline PEA turnover might simply be less affected by exogenous administration than tissues that are under inflammatory stress and actively producing more PEA. It's like boosting the signal where it's most needed.
That makes intuitive sense. It's helping the body do what it's already attempting to do, but potentially amplifying that local protective response where it's most needed. So, to summarize this initial understanding, we're looking at an endogenous fatty acid amide, synthesized on demand during injury, acting locally as an aliomide, with these broad anti-inflammatory, analgesic, and neuroprotective properties demonstrated in various models.
Precisely. And the specific focus of the academic thesis we're drawing from, and thus our deep dive today, is to really delve into the detailed efficacy and mechanisms of PEA in these key areas. The sensory systems, eyesight, hearing, and olfaction, as well as its impact on respiratory inflammation, including conditions like influenza and more recently COVID-19.
And we'll also be looking closely at the mechanisms, right? How it actually works, the impact of different formulations like PLOD and PALA, and critically comparing the strength of the evidence across these varied applications.
Exactly. We need to rigorously examine all of that based on the source material.
Perfect. That sets the stage beautifully. Now let's peel back the layers and dive deeper into the fundamental biological mechanisms. How does PEA actually exert these anti-inflammatory, analgesic, and neuroprotective actions at a molecular level? It sounds complex.
Okay, let's unpack this because it is complex. The first thing to really grasp is that PEA's effects aren't mediated by a single isolated target. It's not like a key fitting into one lock.
Not a magic bullet situation.
Yeah. Not at all. Its wide range of actions stems from its interaction with multiple molecular targets and signaling pathways simultaneously. It's the collective engagement with this network that gives it its broad therapeutic profile.
So it's modulating several things at once, a pleiotropic effect.
Exactly. Pleiotropic is the word. And arguably the most prominent and extensively studied target family for PEA is the peroxisome proliferator activated receptors, or PPRs.
PPRs. Okay.
PEA is recognized as an endogenous ligand, a natural key for PPRs, with PPR alpha, or PPAR, being identified as a principal target. Much of the research zeroes in on PPR alpha.
PPR alpha. Got it. How does PEA binding to that translate into biological effects? What happens next?
So when PEA binds to PPR, the receptor can undergo conformational changes, basically changing its shape. It typically then gets internalized into the cell nucleus.
Inside the nucleus.
Yes. There, it forms a partnership, a heterodimer complex, with another nuclear receptor called retinoid X receptor, or RXR. This PPAR-XR heterodimer pair then binds to specific DNA sequences in the genome. These sequences are called PPAR response elements, or PPREs.
Binding directly to DNA.
Exactly. And by binding to these PPREs, it directly modulates the expression of target genes. It influences which genes get turned on or turned off.
So this is the genomic pathway influencing gene expression. Slower, maybe, but potentially more sustained effects. What kind of downstream effects does that have?
Precisely. This genomic pathway leads to slower but more sustained effects because it involves the machinery of gene transcription and protein synthesis. Downstream, this results in things like decreased production of pro-inflammatory cytokines, key signaling molecules in inflammation. It also leads to inhibition of mast cell degranulation.
We'll come back to mast cells, I'm sure.
Oh, yes. And reduced activation of glial cells like microglia, the immune cells of the brain, and attenuation of oxidative stress markers. So these actions directly contribute to its anti-inflammatory and cytoprotective capabilities.
And is it only PPAR alpha or are other PPARs involved?
While PPAR is definitely central and the most robustly linked target, the source does mention evidence suggesting PEA can also influence other PPAR isoforms like PPAR gamma and PPAR delta. This might potentially add to its broad effects, but PPAR really seems to be the main player in this genomic pathway for PEA.
Okay, so there's a clear, albeit slower, pathway through gene modulation via PPAR alpha. But the source also highlights rapid analgesic effects. That seems contradictory to slow gene changes. How does PEA achieve rapid effects if it's not via changes in gene expression?
Right, and this is where it gets really interesting and adds another layer of complexity. PEA also elicits rapid non-genomic effects. These happen much faster because they don't involve the time-consuming process of changing gene transcription.
Non-genomic.
Yeah.
So acting outside the nucleus.
Potentially. These rapid actions are often associated with pain relief. The thinking, as outlined in the source, is that this involves modulating the activity of certain ion channels in the cell membrane, particularly medium and large calcium channels,
Affecting ion channels directly.
possibly indirectly. The modulation likely happens via a complex formed by the activated PPARO interacting with other signaling proteins right there at the cell membrane, or perhaps in the cytoplasm. This interaction is thought to occur independently of its nuclear gene modulating activity.
So the same receptor, PPAR alpha, can mediate two different types of responses depending on how or where it's activated. Slower, sustained anti-inflammatory effects via the nucleus and rapid analgesic effects potentially at the membrane. That's quite sophisticated for a single molecule.
It is, absolutely. And this dual genomic, non-genomic mode of action through PPAR alpha is a fundamental aspect for understanding PEA's clinical profile. It helps explain how it might offer both potential or rapid symptomatic relief, particularly for pain, and longer-term effects on inflammation resolution and tissue health through those changes in gene expression. It's a multifaceted engagement.
Very interesting. Now, moving beyond PPARs, the source places PEA within the context of the endocannabinoid system, or ECS. We hear a lot about the ECS. Is PEA a classic endocannabinoid itself, like anandamide?
That's a common point of confusion. It's often classified as part of the extended endocannabinoid system, or sometimes called an endocannabinoid-like compound. And this is because it does share structural similarities and, crucially, metabolic pathways with classical endocannabinoids like anandamide, also known as AEA.
Similar structure, shared metabolism. But is its interaction the same?
No, and this is a critical distinction the source makes. Its interaction with the main canonical ECS targets the CB1 and CB2 receptors is primarily indirect.
Primarily indirect. Okay, so it doesn't bind strongly to those main cannabinoid receptors that things like THC or even anandamide bind to.
Correct. Generally speaking, PEA exhibits low, often negligible, direct binding affinity for the classical CB1 and CB2 receptors. Its main influence on the ECS is thought to be through what's become known as the entourage effect.
The entourage effect. That term comes up a lot. How does PEA facilitate this? What does it actually do?
In this context, the entourage effect refers specifically to PEA's ability to enhance the levels and actions of our own endogenous cannabinoids, particularly anandamide, AEA.
Enhancing our own natural cannabinoids. How?
The primary mechanism described is the inhibition of the enzymes that break down AEA. Think of AEA having a lifespan in the body before it's degraded. PEA seems to interfere with that degradation process. It may compete with AEA for the primary degrading enzyme, which is called FAAH, fatty acid amide hydrolase, or it might modulate other metabolic enzymes involved in AEA breakdown.
So by slowing down AEA's degradation, it effectively increases the local concentration of AA. And that allows AEA to stick around longer and act more strongly at its own receptors, CB1, CB2, and maybe others like TRPV1 channels.
Precisely. This leads to elevated local AEA levels and prolonged engagement with its targets. The source also adds another layer. PEA might indirectly boost CB2 receptor signaling by actually increasing the expression of CB2 receptors on inflammatory cells. And interestingly, this upregulation seems linked back to its activation of PPAR.
Wow. It really is a complex, interconnected network of effects. Framing the entourage effect this way, amplifying the body's own endogenous cannabinoid system, suggests the kind of homeostatic amplification mechanism, doesn't it?
That's precisely the way to think about it. It's sophisticated. By modulating endogenously produced cannabinoids, PEA amplifies existing physiological pathways that are often already ramped up in areas of inflammation or injury. This indirect approach is quite distinct from using direct exogenous agonists like synthetic cannabinoids that directly hit CB receptors systemically.
And potentially safer.
That's the implication. It could offer a more nuanced and likely safer profile, perhaps avoiding some of the psychoactive effects associated with strong CB1 activation or the systemic side effects of broad CB receptor stimulation. It's about fine-tuning the body's own system.
That makes a lot of sense conceptually. Okay, so beyond PPARs and this indirect ECS modulation, are there other notable targets PEA interacts with that the source highlights?
Yes, the source identifies interactions with other receptors beyond those families. These include a couple of so-called orphan G protein-coupled receptors, specifically GPR55 and GPR119.
Orphan receptors GPR55 and GPR119. Orphan, meaning their primary endogenous ligand wasn't initially known. What are their potential roles in PEA's effects?
Exactly. PEA's activation of GPR55 has been implicated in some of its anti-anaphylactic effects, potentially through actions on mast cells again. And intriguingly, as the source notes, GPR55 activation might also play a role in modulating aqueous humor outflow in the eye.
Connecting back to glaucoma potential already.
Yes, that link is suggested. GPR119, the other one, is associated with potential metabolic and anti-inflammatory effects, although perhaps less studied in the context of PEA compared to GPR55 or PPR-alpha.
And how about TRPV1 channels? You mentioned AEA acts on them. Does PEA interact there too? Those are linked to pain sensation, right?
Yes, absolutely. Transient receptor potential vinylode type 1, or TRPV1, channels are well-known players in detecting painful stimuli, particularly heat, and they're heavily involved in transmitting pain signals and contributing to inflammation. PEA can interact with TRPV1.
How? Directly activating or blocking?
It seems to modulate its activity. This could happen in a couple of ways, according to the source. It might involve desensitizing these channels on sensory neurons after initial activation, effectively numbing them to further stimuli. Or it could potentiate the action of AEA at TRPV1 sites, working synergistically with the endocannabinoid it helps preserve. Either way, it contributes to its analgesic properties.
So the picture is becoming very clear. PEA doesn't just act on one or two things. It's engaging with multiple relevant targets across different signaling families. PPARs, the ECS indirectly, GPRs, TRPV1.
Right. The engagement with GPR55, GPR119, and TRPV1 really demonstrates that its mechanisms extend significantly beyond just the PPARs and indirect cannabinoid modulation. Each of these additional targets is involved in distinct physiological processes relevant to inflammation, pain, and even metabolism.
This molecular promiscuity, as the source might term it, doesn't sound like a bad thing in this context.
Not necessarily. It shouldn't be seen as unfocused. Instead, it suggests PEA is potentially capable of addressing complex conditions that involve multiple contributing pathways like neuropathic pain or chronic inflammation by modulating several key points simultaneously. It's hitting the problem from multiple angles.
That multi-target action seems fundamental to its reported broad anti-inflammatory and neuroprotective effects. How does this translate to specific cellular actions, particularly on immune and support cells? The source emphasizes non-neuronal cells.
Yes, a critical component of PEA's action, especially its anti-inflammatory and neuroprotective effects, involves its influence on non-neuronal cells. This includes mast cells and glial cells, specifically microglia and astrocytes, particularly within the nervous system.
Let's start with mast cells. Where are they found and why are they important here?
Mast cells are ubiquitous, found strategically positioned near nerves, blood vessels, and lining epithelial surfaces like the airways and gut. They are key early responders in inflammation and allergic reactions. When activated, they degranulate, releasing a potent cocktail of preformed and newly synthesized mediators.
Degranulation sounds explosive.
It can be. They dump chemicals like histamine, TNF-alpha, various interleukins, proteases, chemokines, all drivers of inflammation. Now, PEA has a well-documented ability to effectively inhibit mast cell degranulation.
So it essentially calms down these inflammatory first responders, prevents them from releasing their payload?
Exactly. It stabilizes them. It prevents or reduces the release of those key inflammatory mediators. This mast cell stabilizing effect is absolutely central to its anti-inflammatory profile and aligns perfectly with its role as an aliomide controlling inflammation right at the local site where it starts.
Makes sense. And what about glial cells in the nervous system, microglia, and astrocytes?
In the central nervous system and even in peripheral nervous tissues like the retina, glial cells, microglia, and astrocytes are critical players. They normally support neurons, but in response to injury or disease, they can become activated. When dysregulated, this activation contributes significantly to neuroinflammation and pain sensitization. They are major drivers in conditions like neuropathic pain and neurodegenerative diseases.
So how does PEA affect these glial cells? Does it just shut them down?
It's more nuanced than just shutting them down. PEA has been shown to reduce the overall activation of microglia. But perhaps even more intriguingly, as highlighted in the source, it can promote a shift in microglial phenotype. It encourages them to move away from a pro-inflammatory state, often called the M1 phenotype, towards an anti-inflammatory, neuroprotective, and tissue-repairing state, the M2 phenotype.
So it's not just dampening their harmful activity, it's actively steering them towards a beneficial healing role.
Yeah.
That sounds like a much more sophisticated form of immune modulation than just blocking inflammation.
It really is. And this modulation of non-neuronal cells, mast cells peripherally and glia centrally, is absolutely central to PEA's neuroprotective and anti-inflammatory effects, particularly in conditions affecting the nervous system. These cells are major drivers and amplifiers of inflammatory and pain processes. By stabilizing mast cells and guiding glia towards protective phenotypes, PCA effectively interrupts inflammatory cascades, often upstream of direct neuronal damage.
The significance for conditions like neuropathic pain, or maybe post-viral issues like the olfactory loss we'll discuss, or even glaucoma, where neuroinflammation is implicated, seems profound.
It is potentially profound, yes. Targeting these non-neuronal drivers is a key aspect of its therapeutic potential in those areas.
And how do these cellular effects tie back into his broader impact on the biochemical markers of inflammation, like cytokines?
Well, these effects cascade down logically. Consistent with its actions on immune cells and its activation of PPAO, PEA leads to a significant reduction in the synthesis and release of major pro-inflammatory cytokines, think TNFA, IL-1, IL-6, IL-8, and also chemokines, which recruit more immune cells.
So less inflammatory signaling overall.
Less signaling, and it also contributes to antioxidant effects, reducing oxidative stress, which almost always accompanies inflammation and degeneration. Furthermore, a key molecular target downstream is the inhibition of NF-B activation.
NF-kappa B, that's a big one in inflammation, isn't it?
It's a master switch. NF-key is a transcription factor that orchestrates the expression of a vast array of inflammatory genes. These include genes for cytokines, chemokines, adhesion molecules that help immune cells stick to blood vessels, and enzymes like KOX2 and INase that produce inflammatory mediators. By inhibiting NF-B activation, PEA effectively reduces the production of many of these key inflammatory drivers.
It's like turning off the main switch for a whole network of inflammatory responses. And in the context of pain, you mentioned earlier, it affects sensitization. How does that fit in?
Yes. Its analgesic effects are mediated in part by reducing both peripheral sensitization, where nerve endings and tissues become hypersensitive, and central sensitization, where neurons in the spinal cord and brain become hyperexcitable. These are key processes in the development and maintenance of chronic pain states. By modulating inflammation locally and tamping down glial activation centrally, PEA reduces the constant barrage of signals that drive this sensitization.
Okay, so it's clear that PEA operates through this incredibly complex network of interactions, hitting multiple targets, receptors, enzymes, cell types that are all relevant to inflammation, pain, and cellular protection. The source refers to Table 2.1 as a summary of these molecular targets and outcomes.
That's right. Table 2.1 provides a helpful consolidated view. It lists the key players we've discussed. PPA-ARA, the indirect effects via FAAH on AEA, the entourage effect, GPR55, TPR119, TRPV1, and its direct actions on mast cells and microglia, leading to downstream effects on NF-κB and cytokines. This table is really essential for grasping how PEA achieves its broad pleiotropic effects through these diverse and interconnected interactions. It strongly reinforces that it's not a simple one-target drug, but a complex modulator of the body's own systems.
Okay, that comprehensive look at the mechanisms is absolutely critical for understanding PEA's potential. But, as with any potential therapeutic, how it gets to where it needs to go in its pharmacokinetics is just as important as how it works once it gets there. Let's move on to the pharmaceutical side, formulations and pharmacokinetics. How does PEA actually get absorbed and distributed?
Exactly. This is a crucial piece of the puzzle because the clinical efficacy of PEA is profoundly influenced by its inherent physical properties and, importantly, how it's formulated. And as we touched on briefly earlier, Native, standard PEA, just the raw powder, presents a significant challenge right from the start.
What's the primary challenge with standard PEA powder? You mentioned its lipid nature.
Yes, native PEA is highly lipophilic. It loves fat and hates water. It's practically insoluble in water, which is reflected in its high log p-value. The source quotes it as greater than 5.2.
Poor water solubility. That's a major hurdle for oral absorption, right? Because the gastrointestinal tract is fundamentally an aqueous environment.
It is a huge hurdle. When you take standard PEA powder orally, its absorption is severely limited by how quickly it can dissolve in the GI fluids. The rate at which the solid particles can actually go into solution dictates how much can be absorbed across the gut wall. This low dissolution rate potentially restricts its systemic bioavailability and, consequently, its clinical effectiveness if you just administer it as a simple, unformulated powder.
So how have pharmaceutical scientists addressed this fundamental solubility and dissolution issue? What's the fix?
The primary strategy developed over the years to overcome this limitation has been particle size engineering, specifically through patented micronization and, even further, ultramicronization techniques.
Micronization and ultramicronization, making the particles smaller. What are the target particle sizes with these techniques?
Generally, yes, making them much smaller. Micronized PEA, often denoted as PEAM, typically involves reducing particles down to a size range of about 2 to 10 micrometers. Ultramicronized PEA, or PEA, goes even smaller, generally achieving particle sizes somewhere between 0.8 and 6 micrometers.
That's a significant reduction in size compared to a standard powder. How does making the particles smaller improve absorption? What's the mechanism there?
It's all about surface area. By drastically reducing the particle size, these techniques vastly increase the total surface area of the PEA material that's exposed to the surrounding liquid. This larger surface area allows the compound to dissolve much, much faster in the gastrointestinal fluids. And as we said, enhanced dissolution is the essential first step for absorption across the gut wall.
So, faster dissolution leads to more getting absorbed. Is there evidence this actually works?
Yes, animal studies have clearly demonstrated the benefit. For example, the source sites work in rat models of inflammation, like carriage and induced paw edema. In those studies, orally administered PEA showed superior efficacy compared to the same dose of the unmicronized or naive PEA.
And have pharmacokinetic studies in animals confirmed this improved absorption directly, perhaps by looking at blood levels after administration?
Absolutely. Studies using isotopically labeled PEA, basically tagging the molecule so it can be tracked in rats, provided direct pharmacokinetic evidence. Oral administration of PEA resulted in significantly higher overall plasma levels compared to the same dose of naive PEA. This confirms its greater absorbability, which is attributed directly to the ultramicronization process enhancing its dissolution.
Okay, improved gastrointestinal absorption makes perfect sense because of the increased surface area and faster dissolution. But the source mentions something particularly important about ultramicronized PEA that goes beyond just better intestinal absorption, something potentially very significant.
Yes, and here's where it gets really interesting and potentially very clinically relevant for certain conditions. A key characteristic attributed specifically to the ultramicronized formulation, PEA, is its potential to more effectively cross the blood-brain barrier, the BBB.
Wow, crossing the blood-brain barrier. That's a potential game changer, isn't it? Especially given its neuroprotective and analgesic properties we discussed. It might not just be getting into the bloodstream better, but potentially getting into the central nervous system more efficiently.
That's exactly the implication. While micronization generally improves intestinal absorption, the enhanced potential for CNS penetration is presented as a critical distinction associated with the even finer particle size achieved with PEA. This suggests that PEA may have enhanced efficacy for conditions specifically affecting the brain and spinal cord.
How so?
Well, not just through achieving higher systemic bioavailability overall, but potentially through more direct access to central targets like glial cells and neurons within the CNS parenchyma itself. This has profound implications for its potential application in neuroinflammatory conditions, central neuropathic pain states, and perhaps even neurodegenerative disorders.
That enhanced CNS penetration potential for PEA is a crucial point for medical professionals evaluating its use, particularly for conditions with central pathology. Is this why micronized and ultramicronized forms are the predominant ones used in clinical trials and available supplements? because they actually work better?
Precisely. They were developed specifically to overcome the bioavailability limitations of native PEA and, in the case of ultramicronization, to potentially enhance CNS delivery, thereby unlocking its therapeutic potential in a way that the basic powder likely couldn't achieve.
Now, beyond just reducing particle size, the source also discusses advanced co-formulations. Combining PEA with other agents, the first one mentioned is PEA combined with luteolin, often referred to as PEOLT. What's the rationale behind putting those two specific compounds together?
This strategy is all about leveraging potential synergistic effects. Luteolin is a well-characterized natural bioflavonoid. On its own, it's recognized as a potent antioxidant, and it also possesses anti-inflammatory properties. It's particularly effective at reducing reactive oxygen species, ROS, those damaging free radicals. Some research also suggests it might help improve microcirculation.
So the idea is to combine PEA's established anti-inflammatory and immunomodulatory actions with luteolin's strong antioxidant capabilities, hitting two birds with one stone, so to speak.
That's the core rationale, exactly. The goal is a multi-targeted approach that addresses different but often interconnected facets of a disease process. Let's take post-COVID-19 olfactory loss as an example, which we'll cover in detail later. Persistent neuroinflammation and oxidative stress in the olfactory system are strongly implicated in causing that prolonged loss of smell.
Okay, so both inflammation and oxidative damage are problems there.
Right. The PELA formulation is designed to provide a dual therapeutic hit in that scenario. PA targets the neuroinflammation, for instance, by modulating glial activity and promoting that shift towards the protective M2 phenotype, while luteolin directly addresses the oxidative stress by scavenging those damaging ROS.
It's hitting two of the main drivers of pathology simultaneously in that specific context. Makes sense. Where is this combination primarily being investigated?
Yes. The primary investigation areas for preloaded, according to the source, are indeed olfactory dysfunction, particularly post-viral loss, and also tinnitus, which we'll discuss. This combination strategy offers a way to target complex conditions where both neuroinflammation and oxidative stress play significant roles. PEA acts on the inflammatory cells and pathways, while luteolin adds a critical layer of antioxidant defense. Given how interconnected inflammation and oxidative stress are in driving tissue damage, addressing both simultaneously with preloaded could potentially lead to greater efficacy than targeting just one process, especially in complex multifactorial conditions like post-viral sequelae affecting sensory systems.
Okay, so Prelude is designed to address neuroinflammation and oxidative stress, particularly targeting olfactory and auditory issues. The other advanced co-formulation mentioned in the source is PEA, combined with alpha-lipoic acid, or ALA, sometimes seen as PEA-ALA. What does ALA bring to this partnership?
Alpha-lipoic acid is another very powerful antioxidant. It's quite valuable because it has a unique property. It's soluble in both water and fat. This allows it to operate effectively in different cellular compartments where ROS might be generated. It's also known for its ability to regenerate other crucial endogenous antioxidants like glutathione and vitamin C and E, essentially boosting the body's overall antioxidant defense system.
So again, a combination focused on tackling both inflammation and oxidative stress, similar to the luteolin combo but using a different antioxidant.
Precisely. The rationale is again synergy, and this combination might be particularly relevant in conditions marked by significant inflammatory and oxidative damage. The source cites an interesting in vitro study as an example. They used human epithelial lung cells stimulated with LPS lipopolysaccharide to mimic the intense inflammatory response and cytokine storm seen in severe infections like COVID-19.
Okay, a lung cell model of severe inflammation. What did they find?
In this model, the combination of ALA and PEA significantly reduced levels of ROS, nitric oxide, another inflammatory mediator, and importantly, modulated key cytokines that are heavily implicated in COVID-19 pathology and lung damage. This in vitro finding strongly suggests a potential for the PEA-ALA combination to counteract severe inflammatory damage and perhaps blunt the intensity of cytokine storms, at least in the respiratory system.
That in vitro data for the PEA-ALA combination is quite compelling, especially in the context of conditions like COVID-19 lung injury. Where else is PEA-ALA being investigated or considered clinically?
It's certainly being investigated for respiratory inflammation, particularly related to conditions like COVID-19 based on that kind of data. It also has clear relevance for neuropathic pain, such as diabetic neuropathy. ALA itself is already a recognized therapeutic agent used for diabetic neuropathy, primarily for its antioxidant properties and effects on nerve health and glucose metabolism. The source mentions one study on diabetic neuropathy that evaluated a complex formulation containing 10 different components, including both PEA and ALA. This complex reported benefits in patients regarding pain reduction, improved vibration perception threshold, a measure of nerve function, and even increased vitamin B12 levels.
Okay, so PALA seems potentially tailored for conditions where both intense inflammation and significant oxidative damage are prominent features, like severe lung injury or complications of diabetes. But the source did include a specific caveat about ALA dosage in one particular study context, didn't it?
Yes, and it's an important detail for interpreting research critically. One study on olfactory dysfunction mentioned in the source apparently used ALA in a control group. However, the source notes that the dosage of ALA used in that specific control arm was considered too low to exert significant systemic anti-inflammatory or antioxidant effects on its own.
Why would they do that?
It seems this was done intentionally in that study design, likely to try and isolate the specific effects of the peel formulation being tested in the active arm, rather than having the control group also receive a potentially active dose of ALA. This specific low-dose use in a control group contrasts sharply with studies specifically designed to leverage the full synergistic potential of therapeutically relevant, higher doses of ALA when intentionally combined with PEA, such as that in vitro lung cell study we just discussed. It really highlights that when evaluating combination studies, you have to pay close attention to the dosage of each component and the study's intent.
That's a crucial nuance for evaluating study results properly. So to synthesize the concept of the PEA-ALA combination, it's framed as a dual therapeutic approach. PEA brings its potent anti-inflammatory and immunomodulatory strength, and ALA provides robust multi-compartment antioxidant defense and potentially other metabolic benefits.
Exactly. In complex diseases where both excessive inflammation and significant oxidative damage are key drivers, think severe COVID-19 lung injury or many diabetic complications, this combination offers a two-pronged strategy. Mechanistically, it makes sense that this could be more effective than targeting just one pathway alone in those challenging conditions.
The source also provides Table 3.1 comparing these various formulations.
Right.
What's the key takeaway message from that summary table?
Table 3.1 essentially gives a concise comparative overview of the different formulations we've just discussed: the naive powder, the micronized form, the ultramicronized PEA, the chelate combination, and the PE-ALA combination. It lists their key distinguishing characteristics, like particle size or the co-component added. Crucially, it notes their impact on bioavailability, emphasizing the improved absorption with micronization, ultramicronization, and specifically highlighting the potential for enhanced BBB penetration with PEA. It also lists the primary clinical indications where each specific formulation has been most studied. It serves as a really valuable summary, illustrating the pharmaceutical evolution of PEA and how formulation science has been absolutely key in enhancing its properties and targeting its utility towards specific clinical areas.
It's fascinating how much the formulation dictates the potential application and effectiveness. Now that we've covered the fundamental mechanisms and the crucial pharmaceutical strategies used to optimize PEA delivery, let's start applying this detailed knowledge to the specific systems covered in the thesis, beginning with ocular health, the eyes.
Yes, the eye is a particularly compelling area for PEA investigation, precisely because of its established anti-inflammatory, neuroprotective, and quite intriguingly, its intraocular pressure-lowering properties. The primary focus in the source material, as you'd expect given the clinical relevance, is on glaucoma, and to a lesser but still mechanistically relevant extent, diabetic retinopathy.
Glaucoma, a major cause of irreversible blindness worldwide, characterized by progressive damage to the optic nerve, often but not always, associated with elevated intraocular pressure, or IOP. How does PEA fit into this complex picture? Is it naturally present in the eye?
Yes. Interestingly, PEA is endogenous to ocular tissues. It's naturally present in various parts of the eye, including the ciliary body, which is the structure responsible for producing the aqueous humor fluid that largely determines the intraocular pressure. And importantly, studies cited in the source have actually shown lower levels of PEA in the ciliary body of eyes affected by glaucoma compared to healthy eyes.
Lower levels in diseased eyes. That suggests a potential disruption, maybe an insufficiency, in this local protective molecule in the disease state itself.
Exactly. That observation hints at a possible role for endogenous PEA in maintaining normal ocular homeostasis and perhaps a deficit contributing to pathology. And clinically, building on that, there's substantial evidence presented in the source regarding exogenous PEA's ability to actually reduce IOP in patients with glaucoma.
As a standalone treatment, or is it typically used alongside conventional therapies?
Typically, it's evaluated and used as an adjunct therapy, so it's added on top of conventional glaucoma medications, things like prostaglandin analogs or beta blockers such as timolol, oral PEA, generally in its micronized or ultramicronized forms to ensure adequate absorption, often at dosages ranging from, say, 300 milligrams twice daily up to 600 milligrams once daily, has demonstrated a statistically significant additional IOP lowering effect in clinical trials.
Additional lowering, how much?
One specific clinical trial cited in the source showed that adjunctive PEA therapy led to a further 16% reduction in IOP compared to patients receiving the conventional therapy, timolol in that case, alone.
A 16% further reduction in IOP on top of standard treatment is definitely clinically meaningful when you're trying to preserve vision, especially in progressive disease. Does it show efficacy only in high-pressure glaucoma, or does it also work in normal tension glaucoma, where IOP isn't the main problem?
That's a key point. The source highlights benefits even in low pressure or normal tension glaucoma, NTG. This is a form where optic nerve damage occurs despite IOP levels being within the statistically normal range, really emphasizing the role of non-IOP factors like vascular issues or direct neurodegeneration. In one trial involving NTG patients, ultramicronized PEA at 300 milligrams twice daily significantly reduced the mean IOP from around 14 mmHg down to about 11 mmHg after 6 months of treatment.
So reducing pressure even when it's already normal, suggesting it might have benefits beyond just high pressure. Anything else on IOP?
Yes, it's also shown efficacy in preventing those temporary but potentially damaging IOP spikes that can sometimes occur after certain laser procedures used for glaucoma, like laser peripheral iridotomy.
Okay, so it seems to be effective in reducing IOP across different glaucoma presentations. What are the proposed mechanisms for this pressure-lowering effect? How does it actually do that?
The IOP lowering is primarily attributed to enhancing the outflow of aqueous humor from the eye. Essentially, it makes it easier for the fluid produced inside the eye to drain out.
Improving the drainage system.
Exactly. The source details that PEA increases the facility of this outflow in a concentration-dependent manner. This process seems to involve specific molecular targets we've already mentioned, engagement with the G protein-coupled receptor, GPR55, and the nuclear receptor, PPAR. Downstream, this signaling is thought to affect cells within the trabecular meshwork, which is the eye's primary drainage tissue, potentially via pathways like the P4244 MAPK pathway. This might modulate cell contractility or the extracellular matrix in a way that improves the fluid flow out of the eye.
Okay, so it acts on specific receptors and signaling cascades within the eye's drainage system to facilitate outflow. That explains the pressure effect. But as we discussed with the general mechanisms, PEA also has distinct neuroprotective properties. Is this relevant for protecting the optic nerve neurons themselves in glaucoma?
Absolutely, and this is where PEA offers a potentially unique advantage in glaucoma management, going beyond just IOP control. Its neuroprotective actions are highly relevant for preserving the health and function of the optic nerve head and the retinal ganglion cells, RGCs. These RGCs are the specific neurons that are progressively damaged and die off in glaucoma, leading to vision loss.
And is there clinical evidence suggesting it helps protect these cells?
Yes, clinical studies cited in the source suggest that adjunctive PEA therapy may help preserve or even improve visual field parameters, which reflect RGC function and potentially other measures of RGC health.
How does it protect these delicate nerve cells in the context of glaucoma? What's the mechanism of neuroprotection here?
These neuroprotective effects link back directly to the broad mechanisms we discussed earlier. It's about its anti-inflammatory actions, its ability to inhibit chronic inflammatory processes within the retina and optic nerve, and protecting neural cells from various insults, including oxidative stress and potentially excitotoxicity. A specific example cited in the source is PEA's ability to inhibit the overactivation of Mueller glia in the retina.
Mueller glia. Those are support cells in the retina.
Yes, they are essential supporting glial cells, but when they become dysregulated or overactivated, as often happens in glaucoma, they can actually release pro-inflammatory molecules and cytokines that contribute significantly to RGC dysfunction and eventual death. PEA seems to help dampen this harmful glial response, thereby indirectly protecting the neurons they support.
So PEA in glaucoma isn't just about lowering pressure, it's potentially a dual-action compound. It lowers IOP by improving drainage. NDA might directly protect the neurons from the inflammatory and stress processes contributing to their degeneration.
Precisely. That's the key takeaway. This potential dual mechanism lowering IOP by enhancing outflow, mediated partly by GPR55 PPRR, and DD providing direct neuroprotection by modulating glia and inhibiting local inflammation makes it particularly promising for glaucoma management. Glaucoma pathology is complex, involving both mechanical stress from IOP and often IOP-independent neurodegenerative processes. Conventional therapies predominantly focus only on lowering IOP. PEA offers a potential way to address both key components.
And that makes it especially relevant for normal tension glaucoma, where neuroprotection is arguably even more critical because high IOP isn't the main driver.
Exactly. The neuroprotective aspect is highly relevant for NTG.
What are the typical dosages used in these ophthalmic studies, and what about safety and tolerability in this context?
Typical dosages used in the clinical trials reviewed in the source generally range from 600 milligrams daily, often split into two doses, like 300 milligrams twice a day, though higher doses, potentially up to 1,200 milligrams daily, have been explored, perhaps for more advanced cases. Micronized or ultramicronized forms are definitely preferred due to their improved bioavailability being essential for efficacy.
And safety.
Regarding safety, PEA consistently demonstrates a favorable profile in these ophthalmic studies. It's generally reported as being very well tolerated, with very few, if any, significant adverse effects reported. Importantly, no major drug interactions have been documented, which is crucial for an adjunctive therapy added to existing glaucoma medication regimens.
That favorable safety profile is certainly a major advantage for a chronic condition requiring potentially lifelong treatment. Now, you also mentioned diabetic retinopathy as another area of investigation in the eye. What's the status of PEA research there?
Diabetic retinopathy, or DR, is a very common and severe complication of diabetes. It's characterized by progressive damage to the retinal blood vessels, which can lead to swelling, bleeding, and ultimately significant vision loss. Its pathogenesis is complex, involving chronic inflammation, neurodegeneration within the retina, and vascular dysfunction, all processes that, as we now know, PEA is capable of modulating based on its core mechanisms.
So there's a strong mechanistic rationale based on PEA's known anti-inflammatory and neuroprotective actions fitting the pathology of DR.
A very strong rationale, yes. The source points out something interesting here, too. The levels of endogenous endocannabinoids, including PEA, seem to be altered in diabetic conditions, particularly in the retina affected by DR. For instance, one study found higher levels of another endocannabinoid, 2-AG, specifically in female diabetics with DR. This suggests the potential dysregulation or imbalance of the endogenous lipid signaling system in the diabetic eye.
Implying that supplementing with PEA might help restore balance.
Exactly. Acting as an aliomide, exogenous PEA might help restore that balance by bolstering a potentially compromised endogenous protective response.
And what does the preclinical evidence, like animal models of DR, suggest? Does it show benefits there?
The preclinical evidence from animal models of DR is certainly promising. PEA has been shown to inhibit the activity of toll-like receptor 4, TLR4, a receptor implicated in the inflammatory cascade driving DR. It reduces markers of retinal inflammation. It inhibits neovascularization, that's the abnormal leaky blood vessel growth characteristic of advanced proliferative DR. It suppresses profibrotic changes that can scar the retina, and it attenuates Miller gliosis again, dampening that harmful overactivation of retinal support cells we talked about in glaucoma. These beneficial effects observed in animal models are often linked to increased PPAR expression within the retina.
That sounds very positive from the preclinical side. But is there extensive direct clinical evidence in humans, specifically looking at PEA's impact on key DR endpoints like disease progression or visual acuity changes?
This is where the evidence base differs significantly from glaucoma, according to the source. It notes a current lack of extensive direct clinical evidence from large randomized controlled trials specifically powered to look at PEA's effect on key human DR endpoints. We don't have large trials showing it slows progression, reduces diabetic macular edema, or improves visual acuity in people with DR yet.
So while the mechanistic rationale is compelling and the preclinical data is supportive, it currently lacks that robust clinical trial validation specifically for DR in humans.
That's the assessment based on the source material, yes.
So how would you critically appraise the overall clinical evidence for PEA in ophthalmic applications, comparing glaucoma and DR based on the source?
Okay, let's compare. For glaucoma, the evidence strength is assessed as moderate to strong. This rating is supported by multiple published randomized controlled trials demonstrating that significant adjunctive IOP reduction. There's also promising, albeit still developing, data suggesting neuroprotection. Plus, the underlying mechanisms involving outflow enhancement via GPR55 and PTAR are relatively well defined in the ocular context. For diabetic retinopathy, the evidence is currently described as more inferential. We have that strong mechanistic rationale based on its known actions fitting DR pathology, and we have encouraging preclinical data from animal models. But it awaits direct clinical trial evidence in humans demonstrating efficacy on specific important DR endpoints.
That's a very clear distinction for clinicians to understand, granting the current state of evidence. And for both conditions, I presume larger, longer-term trials are still needed to solidify the findings.
Absolutely. For both glaucoma and DR, larger, longer-term RCTs would be highly beneficial. For glaucoma, they could further confirm sustained visual field preservation and long-term RGC protection, really nailing down the neuroprotective aspect. For DR, they are absolutely essential to establish definitive efficacy in slowing disease progression, impacting visual outcomes positively, and identifying the optimal patient populations and stages of DR that might benefit most from PEA therapy.
So definitely promising for the eye, particularly as an adjunct therapy in glaucoma where the evidence seems more mature. Now, let's shift our focus to another sensory system. Hearing, the auditory system. This seems to be an area where, based on the source, the clinical data might be less established compared to glaucoma.
That's correct. The application of PEA, and particularly that combination formulation PLIT, ultramicronized PEA with luteolin, is still considered an emerging area for auditory disorders. The primary focus discussed in the source material here is tinnitus.
Tinnitus, that perception of sound like ringing, buzzing, or hissing without any actual external source. It's incredibly common and can be truly debilitating for sufferers. What's the rationale for considering PEA and luteolin, that PILA combo, for this condition?
Tinnitus is indeed common, and its underlying causes are diverse. The pathophysiology is complex, often involving initial damage to peripheral structures in the inner ear, like the cochlear hair cells. However, chronic tinnitus is often linked to maladaptive plasticity changes in how the brain processes sound and chronic neuroinflammation within the central auditory pathways. Altered neuronal excitability is also a key feature. Importantly, oxidative stress and inflammation are common factors implicated in both the initial cochlear damage and the subsequent dysfunction in the auditory pathways.
So the PILA combination targets those familiar culprits we keep discussing, inflammation and oxidative stress, but this time specifically within the context of the auditory system in tinnitus pathology.
Precisely. The palate formulation is designed to leverage the complementary actions of its components, tailored for this context. PEA provides the neuroimmunomodulation. It aims to target the inflammation by modulating mast cells, macrophages, and potentially microglia within the auditory pathways. Luteolin contributes its potent antioxidant capacity, scavenging those damaging ROS, and, as mentioned before, it's also suggested to potentially improve microcirculation, which could be vital for the health of the delicate tissues within the inner ear. The overall aim is to address both the inflammatory and oxidative stress pathways believed to contribute significantly to the generation and persistence of tinnitus.
What clinical investigations are currently underway or have been reported for palate in tinnitus? The source mentions a key trial design, doesn't it?
Yes, a notable trial mentioned in the source material is the TINIPIA trial. This is described as a longitudinal, randomized, placebo-controlled, triple-blind study. It aimed to enroll approximately 100 adults suffering from tinnitus.
Triple-blind and placebo control certainly suggests a rigorous design methodology. What are they comparing and measuring in this specific trial?
The study design compared two active treatment arms, Pelamit given at 1 sachet per day versus Pelit at 2 sachets per day against a placebo group. The treatment period was set for 60 days. The primary outcomes, as registered for the trial, were expected to be changes in tinnitus severity and its impact on the patient's life, measured using validated subjective questionnaires. They also plan to include objective measures from audiometric exams and possibly acouphenometry, which tries to match the perceived tinnitus sound. Evaluations were planned at baseline, then at 3 months and 6 months post-treatment initiation.
And based on the trial design and the known mechanisms of PEA and luteolin, what were the expected results hypothesized by the investigators?
As per the trial registration information referenced in the source, the expected outcome was an improvement in tinnitus symptoms in the groups receiving a Pilalute compared to placebo. This anticipated improvement was hypothesized to be attributed specifically to the combined action of luteolin's antioxidant effects, tackling ROS, and PEA's neuroimmunomodulating actions, addressing inflammation, within the auditory system.
Okay, so the trial was specifically designed to test the hypothesis that this dual-action combination targeting inflammation and oxidative stress can actually provide relief for tinnitus sufferers. However, there's a very crucial note that you need to convey from the source regarding the results of this specific tinnitus trial.
Yes, this is absolutely vital for our listeners to understand the current evidence landscape accurately. The source material explicitly states that published results from this specific tinnitus trial were not found within the provided academic materials being reviewed. While other snippets might mention tinnitus trials involving different interventions or contexts, the actual outcome data from this key, rigorously designed HUMPEEL study is not available in the information we have access to for this deep dive.
That's a critical piece of information. So, while the rationale for the umpilate combination in tinnitus is compelling, and there's a rigorous trial design underway or perhaps completed, the definitive published data from this specific study demonstrating efficacy or lack thereof is currently pending, at least based on this source. How would you synthesize the design of the tinnitus trial in light of our understanding of tinnitus pathology?
The tinnitus trial design itself appears thoughtful in attempting to address the multifaceted nature of tinnitus. It acknowledges that tinnitus likely involves issues originating both peripherally, like cochlear damage, and centrally, neuroinflammation, maladaptive plasticity. The hypothesis driving the trial is essentially that PLET can act beneficially on both levels. PEA's neuroimmunomodulation aiming to address central neuroinflammation and glial dysfunction, while ludiolin's antioxidant effects and potential microcirculation benefits support peripheral cochlear health and protect against further damage. The inclusion of both subjective measures, questionnaires capturing the patient's actual experience and burden, and objective measures, audiology, is also important for trying to comprehensively assess the impact of the intervention.
Based purely on the known mechanisms of PEA and luteolin from other research areas, what are the hypothesized or putative mechanisms by which they might exert beneficial effects in auditory pathologies like tinnitus, even if not yet clinically proven?
Based on their established pharmacology, several potential mechanisms could theoretically be at play within the auditory system. Firstly, the reduction of neuroinflammation within the cochlea itself and along the central auditory pathways, achieved by modulating glial cell activity and inhibiting pro-inflammatory cytokine release. Secondly, the modulation of mast cells, which are present in the inner ear and whose mediators can contribute to auditory dysfunction. Thirdly, significant antioxidant effects, primarily expected from luteolin but potentially supported by PEA via PPAR-IO activation, protecting the very delicate auditory hair cells and neurons from damage by reactive oxygen species. Fourthly, a potential improvement of microcirculation within the cochlea, possibly via luteolin, ensuring adequate oxygen and nutrient supply and waste removal. And finally, a general neuroprotective effect, helping to preserve the function and survival of auditory neurons under stress.
So a range of plausible mechanisms based on where PEA and luteolin are known to act systemically. How do we evaluate the current scientific evidence for PEA in auditory disorders overall, given the critical lack of published outcome data from the key tinnitus trial, as noted in the source?
Based purely on the source material provided for this review, the scientific evidence for PEA or the PLET combination specifically in tinnitus or other forms of hearing loss must be described as being in its nascent stages. The primary support for its potential currently comes from the strong mechanistic rationale, the fact that it targets inflammation and oxidative stress, which are known contributors to tinnitus, and the existence of rigorously designed trials like tinnitus that are intended to test this hypothesis.
But without published results from these key trials, the evidence is largely based on hypothesis and trial design rather than confirmed clinical outcomes impacting patients.
That is the current reality in this specific clinical area, as presented in the source, yes. The evidence base for auditory applications is, at present, largely mechanistically inferred and is awaiting rigorous clinical validation from completed and published randomized controlled trials. While the rationale for using MPLUT in tinnitus is certainly compelling based on its dual anti-inflammatory and antioxidant actions, direct, high-level clinical evidence, specifically demonstrating a benefit for auditory endpoints, is pending the reporting of outcomes from these ongoing or perhaps yet-to-be published studies like tinnitus. This situation stands in clear contrast to areas like chronic pain or glaucoma, where a larger body of clinical data, including published RCTs, already exists.
That is a critical point for clinicians managing patients with tinnitus. It sounds promising mechanistically, but the clinical proof isn't there yet, according to this source. What are the key research gaps, the lacunae identified in the source for PEA and auditory applications? Where does future research need to focus?
The key research lacunae are quite clear from this assessment. First and foremost is the urgent need for the publication of results from well-designed RCTs, like the TINA-PA trial, to confirm or refute clinical efficacy and safety specifically in tinnitus patients. Beyond tinnitus, there's a need for investigation into other types of hearing loss where inflammation and oxidative stress might also play roles, such as noise-induced hearing loss, age-related hearing loss, presbycusis, or sudden sensorineural hearing loss. Further research is definitely required to specifically elucidate the precise mechanisms by which PEA and luteolin exert effects within the complex auditory system itself. Are they acting peripherally, centrally, or both? Optimal dosing regimens and the necessary duration of treatment for potential auditory benefits are also not definitively established. And finally, head-to-head clinical trials comparing different PEA formulations, for example, PEA alone versus umpalote, or other combination therapies for auditory issues would be valuable to guide future strategies.
So, to summarize for the auditory system, well, the potential is mechanistically exciting, especially for tinnitus. Given the peel formulation targeting inflammation and oxidative stress, we are currently in a phase of needing definitive clinical validation from ongoing and future trials. It's an area of potential, but not yet established clinical utility based on the provided source material.
Exactly. Now let's move on to our final sensory system covered in this deep dive. Olfactory function, our sense of smell. This is another area where PEA, particularly that ELP formulation, has garnered significant recent attention, heavily influenced, as you might expect, by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Ah, yes, post-viral olfactory dysfunction. The prolonged or sometimes chronic loss, anosmia, reduction, hyposmia, or distortion parosmia of smell that became so distressingly prevalent after SARS-CoV-2 infection for many people. Why is PEA specifically in the umpeel combination considered a promising intervention here? What's the link?
The current understanding of post-COVID-19 olfactory dysfunction points very strongly towards persistent neuroinflammation within the olfactory system as a key underlying cause. This inflammation seems to affect the olfactory epithelium, where the smell receptor neurons are, the olfactory bulb, the first relay station for smell information in the brain, and potentially even higher olfactory processing centers in the brain. This lingering neuroinflammatory state is believed to be a primary driver of the persistent smell problems like anosmia, hyposmia, and also parosmia.
So the Piliad combination with its anti-inflammatory PEA and antioxidant luteolin is specifically targeted at counteracting this neuroinflammation thought to be driving the smell loss.
That is precisely the core hypothesis and the mechanistic rationale driving its use and investigation in this context. Multiple clinical trials, as reviewed in the source, have investigated umpalute for post-COVID olfactory dysfunction. Importantly, these trials frequently combined umpalute with olfactory training.
Olfactory training. Remind us what that involves.
Olfactory training involves the regular, structured sniffing of a defined set of different odorants, often rose, eucalyptus, lemon, clove, usually twice a day for several months. The goal is to systematically stimulate the olfactory system and promote recovery pathways through neuroplasticity.
Okay, so often Piliad plus the smell training.
Mm.
What was the general finding across these studies? Did the combination help?
The general finding reported across these studies, according to the source, is that Piliad, often when used in conjunction with olfactory training, can lead to significant improvement in olfactory function in affected patients compared to controls or baseline.
Let's get into the specifics of those clinical outcomes reported in the source. What kind of improvements were observed? How were they measured?
Key outcomes reported include significant improvement in objective odor identification scores. These are typically measured using validated psychophysical tests like the Snip and Sticks battery, which assesses threshold, discrimination, and identification abilities. Patients receiving umpalute, either alone or, more often, with OT, depending on the specific study design, showed statistically significant improvements in these scores compared to their baseline scores or control groups. For example, one trial specifically mentioned an average improvement of 10.7 points from baseline in the composite TDI, threshold discrimination identification score, after 3 months of umpeel therapy.
A 10.7-point average improvement on Sniff and Sticks sounds like a potentially substantial clinical improvement for someone who couldn't smell well. And how did the combination therapy umpeel plus olfactory training compare to either intervention used alone? Was the combination better?
Several studies highlighted in the source strongly suggest that the combination of umpalute and olfactory training provides superior results compared to either olfactory training alone or umpalute alone. One specific trial reported quite striking results. A remarkable 89.2% of patients receiving the combined therapy, specifically once daily Ampiolate plus standard OT, achieved what was defined in that study as a clinically significant improvement, a threshold increase of 3 points on the odor identification subtest after 90 days of treatment.
89.2% achieving clinically significant improvement with a combo. How did that compare to the other groups in that trial?
That rate was substantially higher than seen in the groups receiving olfactory training with a placebo, which achieved that threshold in 36.8% of patients, or in groups receiving Ampiol alone, either twice daily, 40% achieved the threshold, or once daily, 41.6% achieved the threshold. So that study strongly pointed towards a synergistic benefit of combining Ampiol with OT.
That 89.2% figure for combined therapy is a compelling statistic, especially when measured against a predefined threshold for clinical significance in that particular study. What about parosmia, the distorted smells that can be very unpleasant? Is a plengulate effective for that qualitative symptom?
Pilosia has been associated with a reduction in the prevalence and severity of parosmia in some studies. However, the source suggests that the efficacy specifically for parosmia might be more variable and perhaps less consistently reported compared to its positive effect on quantitative smell loss, anosmia, hyposmia. One study specifically hypothesized that Pilosi might be more useful for improving the quantitative smell loss, which is often linked more directly to neuroinflammation in the olfactory bulb and central pathways, but perhaps had a more limited effect on parosmia. Parosmia might potentially be related more to peripheral nerve damage or aberrant regeneration within the olfactory neuroepithelium itself, which might respond differently.
Interesting. A potential difference in efficacy, depending on the underlying site or nature of the olfactory dysfunction. Quantitative loss versus qualitative distortion. And were there any benefits reported for associated symptoms often seen in long COVID patients who also have smell loss?
Yes. Interestingly, some studies reported subjective alleviation of associated symptoms commonly experienced in long COVID, such as qualla, often described as mental clouding or brain fog, and even some reported improvement in memory function in patients who were being treated with Pialot primarily for their olfactory loss.
Those reported improvements in cognitive symptoms, even if subjective, suggest the effects might extend beyond just the olfactory system itself, perhaps targeting broader neuroinflammation in the CNS. This ties directly back into the proposed mechanisms, doesn't it? How does Humalot achieve these effects by specifically targeting neuroinflammation in the olfactory system?
Exactly, it reinforces the mechanistic hypothesis. The proposed mechanism centers squarely on counteracting that persistent neuroinflammation within the olfactory pathway. Remember, the olfactory nerve serves as a potential direct entry route for some pathogens, possibly including SARS-CoV-2, into the CNS. Viral infection can cause acute damage, but also trigger prolonged inflammation in the olfactory epithelium, where the primary sensory neurons reside. And critically, in the olfactory bulb, which is the initial smell relay station located just above the nasal cavity in the brain. This chronic neuroinflammatory response involving activated glial cells and inflammatory mediators is considered a key driver of the persistent dysfunction.
So how does the PL combination intervene in that inflammatory process?
It acts synergistically. Firstly, the PEA component, especially in its ultramicronized form, which we know enhances bioavailability and potentially CNS penetration, is thought to act directly on microglial cells within the olfactory bulb and perhaps other affected CNS areas. It modulates their activity, helping to shift them from that pro-inflammatory M1 state towards the anti-inflammatory, neuroprotective, and tissue-repairing M2 phenotype. This helps to resolve the lingering inflammation, reduces glial-mediated damage, and creates a more supportive environment for neuronal recovery and regeneration processes essential for smell restoration. Secondly, the luteolin component contributes its potent antioxidant power. It reduces the reactive oxygen species, ROS, that invariably accompany inflammation and cause significant oxidative damage to olfactory neurons and their supporting cells. Luteolin's antioxidant action helps mitigate this damage and further supports the cellular environment needed for recovery.
So it's a synergistic attack on the two key pathological processes identified: neuroinflammation, targeted by PEA, and oxidative stress, targeted by luteolin, precisely where they are thought to be occurring in the olfactory pathway and potentially associated brain regions.
Yes, that's the model. The consistent finding across multiple trials, as reported in the source, that P-Alta, a formulation specifically designed to target these processes, leads to improved olfactory function, strongly supports the hypothesis that persistent neuroinflammation is indeed a primary driver of this debilitating post-viral deficit. It also reinforces the potential value of PEA, particularly in forms capable of enhanced CNS delivery, like PEA, for other CNS disorders characterized by underlying neuroinflammation.
Based on the source material, how would you evaluate the overall strength and also the limitations of the clinical evidence for PEA, specifically in olfactory restoration after COVID-19?
The evidence strength for umpeel in post-COVID olfactory dysfunction, especially when combined with olfactory training, is generally considered moderate to strong. The strengths underpinning this assessment include the existence of multiple randomized controlled trials, some of which were double-blind, showing consistent, statistically significant improvements in objective olfactory scores using validated measures. This clinical evidence is also strongly backed by that clear and plausible mechanistic rationale centered on countering neuroinflammation and oxidative stress in the olfactory system. However, there are limitations to acknowledge. Some of the earlier or smaller studies may have had limitations in their design, for example, regarding the composition of the control group, especially when combined therapy with OT was involved. As we discussed, the efficacy specifically for parosmia appears more variable or less consistently demonstrated across studies compared to the improvement seen in hyposmia and anosmia. It's also important to manage expectations. While many patients improve significantly, not all achieve full recovery. The source indicates that perhaps around 15% of patients may not regain a fully normal olfactory threshold, and a smaller percentage, maybe around 5%, show no significant recovery even with treatment.
And you mentioned earlier a specific nuance regarding the interpretation of clinical meaningfulness versus straightforward statistical significance in one study. That seems important.
Yes, that's a crucial point for critical appraisal. One study specifically highlighted that while they found a statistically significant improvement in the average olfactory scores for the MPLT plus OT group compared to the OT alone group, they did not find a statistically significant difference between those groups in the rate at which patients achieved a predefined clinically meaningful improvement threshold, like that 3-point increase. This specific finding, while from just one study, underscores the ongoing need for standardized definitions of what constitutes true clinical meaningfulness in olfactory research. It also prompts continued investigation into the precise magnitude of the added clinical benefit of Pelate over and above what can be achieved with rigorous olfactory training alone, which is known to be effective for many patients. It's a critical point for clinicians when interpreting these results and counseling patients about expected outcomes.
That is a very important distinction for medical professionals to consider when looking at the data and making treatment recommendations. So, for post-COVID olfactory loss, the evidence for umpellet, especially when combined with olfactory training, appears quite solid and mechanistically well supported, targeting that neuroinflammation. But we need to be mindful of some nuances regarding the extent of recovery, consistency for parosmia, and the ongoing discussion about defining clinically meaningful benefit over OT alone.
That sums it up well. Now let's turn our attention to the final system covered in detail in this deep dive: the respiratory system and PEA's potential role in inflammation and infections affecting the lungs and airways. This is another area where PEA's core anti-inflammatory and immunomodulatory properties are highly relevant.
Is the concept of using PEA for respiratory conditions a relatively recent idea, perhaps prompted by the intense focus on respiratory viruses like COVID-19?
Interestingly, no, not at all. The source notes that this isn't an entirely new area of investigation for PEA. Quite the contrary, actually. There were apparently 6 clinical trials conducted and published way back in the 1970s. These collectively involved nearly 4,000 individuals, and they specifically studied PEA for treating or preventing influenza and the common cold.
Wow, nearly 4,000 participants in the 1970s studying PEA for colds and flu. That's quite a significant historical body of work. What were the findings from those early trials?
According to the source referencing those historical reports, they generally found that PEA was both effective and notably safe in those studies. They reported benefits in both preventing the incidence of infections, so prophylactic use, and also in reducing the severity and duration of symptoms when used for treatment after infection onset. At the time, the mechanism wasn't well understood and was broadly attributed simply to its general anti-inflammatory action.
So, if there was positive clinical data back then involving thousands of people, why did interest seem to wane for so long until recently?
That's a good question. Interest in PEA generally did seem to wane for a period, and the source suggests this was partly due to a lack of detailed understanding of its precise molecular mechanisms of action back then. Without knowing exactly how it worked, it was perhaps harder to advance clinically or gain widespread acceptance. However, with the explosion of modern insights over the last couple of decades into its interactions with PPARs, the extended ECS, and its specific effects on key cellular players like mast cells and glia, there's been a significant resurgence of interest in its potential, including revisiting its role in respiratory infections and inflammation.
So those early positive clinical data from the 70s, while perhaps lacking modern methodological rigor, when viewed through the lens of our current detailed understanding of PEA's multiple mechanisms, actually lends some historical credibility to reevaluating its potential for contemporary respiratory threats like seasonal influenza or SARS-CoV-2.
Precisely. They provide a valuable historical precedent. It suggests PEA might indeed have antiviral or immune-modulating effects in respiratory infections, and this historical clinical data supports the rationale for revisiting PEA for modern viral challenges, now backed by a much more sophisticated understanding of its broad anti-inflammatory and immunomodulatory capabilities.
Speaking of modern challenges like SARS-CoV-2, how does PEA fit into the context of COVID-19 pathophysiology, particularly the severe inflammatory responses and potentially lethal cytokine storms that can occur in serious cases?
COVID-19 starkly demonstrated the devastating impact of severe respiratory inflammation, the phenomenon of cytokine storms, and the resulting acute lung injury, ALI, or acute respiratory distress syndrome, ARDS. PEA's known mechanisms position it as a strong candidate, mechanistically at least, for potentially mitigating these severe inflammatory responses within the respiratory tract.
How might it modulate cytokine storms and acute lung injury specifically? What are the pathways involved?
PEA could potentially modulate cytokine storms through several of the key actions we've already discussed. It directly reduces the synthesis and secretion of major pro-inflammatory cytokines like interleukin-1 beta, IL-1, interleukin-6, IL-6, and tumor necrosis factor alpha, all central players in the cytokine storm cascade. It inhibits the expression of inducible nitric oxide synthase, INOS, which produces nitric oxide involved in inflammation and vascular changes. It inhibits the activation of the NFP pathway, which, as we know, is that master regulator driving the expression of numerous inflammatory genes crucial for the cytokine storm. And importantly for the lungs, it modulates mast cell activity. Mast cells are abundant in the airways and lung tissue and can contribute significantly to the inflammatory cascade when activated by viral infection.
In the PEA-AL combination we discussed earlier, the one combining PEA with the antioxidant alpha-lipoic acid, is that particularly relevant in the context of COVID-19 lung injury based on the source?
Yes, absolutely. The source specifically highlights this combination's potential relevance here, referencing that in vitro study we discussed. Remember, they used human epithelial lung cells stimulated with LPS to mimic the inflammatory environment and cytokine storm seen in severe COVID-19.
Right, the lung cell model.
In that model, the PEA-LA combination significantly reduced levels of reactive oxygen species, ROS, nitric oxide, NO, and modulated the secretion of key COVID-19-related cytokines, like IL-6 and IL-8. This in vitro data strongly suggests a potential role for this specific combination in counteracting the inflammatory damage and potentially blunting the severity of cytokine storms within the lungs.
That in vitro finding is certainly compelling evidence of potential synergy against lung inflammation. What about animal models of acute lung injury? Have they shown benefits with PEA?
Yes, animal models of ALI have provided further support for these concepts. Studies using ultramicronized PEA in various models of acute lung injury showed that it reduced overall lung injury scores, it decreased the infiltration of neutrophils, key inflammatory cells, into the lung tissue, it limited the recruitment of mast cells to the lungs, and it downregulated key pro-inflammatory cytokines within the lung environment. These beneficial effects observed in animals were linked mechanistically to the modulation of important intracellular signaling pathways involved in inflammation, including components of the mitogen-activated protein kinase, MAPK family like PEARC, PJN, KP38, TEK, and also the crucial NFKB pathway.
So preclinical evidence seems supportive. Are there any direct clinical observations yet for PEA being used in actual COVID-19 patients reported in the source?
Some preliminary clinical observations do exist, but need careful interpretation. The source mentions one observational case control study. This involved patients hospitalized with early-stage COVID-19 who were treated with a relatively high dose of PEA, specifically 18 over 80 milligrams per day, for a period of 28 days in addition to standard care. This observational study reported potentially beneficial anti-inflammatory and modulatory effects in the PEA-treated group. This included a reduction in overall systemic inflammatory markers, like C-reactive protein, decreased markers of oxidative stress, and some favorable changes observed in the coagulation cascade, which is often dangerously dysregulated in severe COVID-19.
But it's crucial to emphasize this was an observational study, right? Not a randomized controlled trial.
Absolutely critical. Observational studies can suggest associations, but cannot definitively prove cause and effect like a well-conducted RCT. So, while promising, these findings need confirmation from rigorous trials.
Okay, so promising preclinical data and some early, albeit preliminary and observational clinical hints. Let's delve a bit deeper into the specific immunomodulatory mechanisms PEA might exert specifically within the respiratory tract. How does it interact with the local immune responses there?
PEA's effects on immune responses within the respiratory tract appear multifaceted, involving several key points of intervention based on its known pharmacology. Firstly, through activating PPAR, which is expressed in both resident immune cells, like macrophages, and the respiratory epithelial cells lining the airways, it leads to the transrepression of pro-inflammatory genes. Essentially, it tells the cell nucleus to turn down the volume on inflammation. It also promotes the upregulation of anti-inflammatory pathways, helping to ameliorate the oxidative and nitrosative stress induced by viral infection. Secondly, it seems to modulate toll-like receptors, TLRs. TLRs are crucial pattern recognition receptors on immune and epithelial cells that act as the first line of defense, detecting viral components like RNA or proteins, and initiating the innate immune response. However, overzealous or prolonged TLR signaling, particularly involving TLR4, which recognizes bacterial components but can also be activated indirectly in viral infections, can contribute significantly to excessive inflammation and lung injury. PEA has demonstrated the ability to modulate TLR4 signaling pathways, potentially dampening these exaggerated innate immune responses before they spiral out of control. The source cites evidence from a colitis model where PEA's anti-inflammatory effects were dependent on both TLR4 modulation and PPAR alpha activation, suggesting a similar interplay could be occurring in the respiratory tract during infection. Thirdly, and critically important in the respiratory system, is its effect on mast cells. We keep coming back to them. Mast cells are particularly abundant throughout the respiratory tract, residing near airways, blood vessels, and glands. They can be rapidly activated by viral infections and subsequently release that potent cascade of inflammatory mediators, histamine, proteases, cytokines, chemokines, which drive airway inflammation, bronchoconstriction, mucus production, and contribute significantly to lung pathology. PEA's established ability to stabilize mast cells and inhibit their degranulation is considered a vital mechanism for limiting inflammatory damage specifically within the respiratory system.
So PEA is potentially acting on multiple levels in the respiratory immune response, modulating the initial pathogen sensors, TLRs, influencing master inflammatory regulators, PPARs, NFE, and stabilizing key effector cells, mast cells, that are abundant in the airways and lungs. It seems to be intervening at multiple critical points in that complex cascade triggered by a viral infection. That sounds like a potentially powerful approach.
Yes, that's the key insight from a mechanistic perspective. Viral infections trigger this complex immune cascade. Pathogen recognition by TLRs leads to activation of downstream signaling, like NFB, which drives cytokine production, which in turn activates various immune cells, including mast cells, leading to inflammation and potential tissue damage. PEA appears to intervene at multiple critical junctures in this chain, modulating TLR4 activity, activating anti-inflammatory PPAR pathways, inhibiting the master inflammatory switch NFE, and stabilizing mast cells. This multi-pronged approach provides a strong mechanistic rationale for why it might be effective in controlling severe lung inflammation, potentially more so than therapies targeting only a single pathway.
Okay, that mechanistic picture is clear. So let's synthesize the evidence for PEA and respiratory conditions overall based purely on the source material provided. How strong is the evidence, combining preclinical and clinical?
All right, let's break it down. The preclinical evidence, stemming from animal models of lung injury and those in vitro studies, looking at both PEA alone and the PEA-LA combination, appears strong. It provides a solid mechanistic basis suggesting PEA can indeed mitigate lung injury and inflammation pathways relevant to respiratory infections. The clinical evidence, however, varies significantly depending on the specific context. For influenza and the common cold, the evidence is best described as emerging historical. We have those intriguing positive clinical trials from the 1970s, but as we noted, they lack the methodological rigor and detailed reporting expected of modern trials and absolutely require contemporary validation with current standards. For COVID-19 lung inflammation, the clinical evidence is similarly rated as emerging. There's that encouraging preclinical data and some supportive but preliminary observational clinical data suggesting potential benefits. However, it currently lacks the necessary large-scale randomized controlled trials needed to definitively establish its efficacy for either acute treatment or prophylaxis in modern clinical practice for COVID-19 or similar severe viral pneumonias.
So to be crystal clear for our listeners, while the mechanisms and the historical or preclinical data are encouraging for respiratory applications for contemporary respiratory viral illnesses like COVID-19 or even seasonal flu, PEA is still very much in the stage of needing rigorous modern clinical trial validation before it can be considered an established therapy.
Exactly. That's the current status based on the comprehensive review presented in the source. We've covered a tremendous amount of ground now, delving into PEA's fundamental biology, its critical formulations, and critically appraising its potential applications across the ocular, auditory, olfactory, and respiratory systems. It's probably time to pull all these diverse threads together and provide a comprehensive synthesis and, importantly, a comparative assessment of the strength of the evidence in each of these areas.
Let's do exactly that. Based on everything we've reviewed from the source thesis, what's the integrated overview? What's the big picture regarding PEA's broad potential across these diverse physiological systems?
The overarching picture that emerges is that the potential of PEA across these varied systems, eyes, ears, nose, lungs, is clearly underpinned by its fundamental, multifaceted biological actions. It's profoundly anti-inflammatory, it's notably neuroprotective, and it acts as a sophisticated immunomodulator. We've seen how these core properties manifest differently depending on the specific tissue context and the underlying pathology. So to recap briefly, in the ocular system, specifically focusing on glaucoma, PEA potentially impacts both intraocular pressure via outflow enhancement involving GPR55 PPAR and offers direct neuroprotection to retinal ganglion cells. In the auditory system, primarily investigated for tinnitus, the umpulate combination aims to target the underlying inflammation and oxidative stress within the auditory pathways. For olfactory function, specifically addressing post-COVID dysfunction, Umpeel is targeted at resolving the persistent neuroinflammation believed to drive the smell deficit. And in respiratory inflammation stemming from conditions like influenza or COVID-19, PEA acts via multiple pathways, modulating NF-key, TLRs, PPARs, and stabilizing mast cells, with the PEA-ALA combination showing particular promise against severe inflammation and cytokine storms in preclinical models.
And the common threads weaving through all of this are those core mechanisms we've dissected. PPR activation, both genomic and non-genomic. The extended ECS involvement via the entourage effect, modulation of receptors like GPR55 and TRPV1, and its critical influence on non-neuronal cells like mast cells and glia. Plus, absolutely central to realizing this potential is the essential role of advanced pharmaceutical formulations.
Precisely. Those common mechanisms underpin its pleiotropic effects, allowing PEA to be relevant, at least mechanistically, across a range of conditions that share underlying processes involving inflammation, immune dysregulation, or neuronal stress. And yes, the formulation's micronized, ultramicronized, PEA, the co-micronized umpilute with luteolin, and PEALA with alpha-lipoic acid are absolutely crucial. They are key for overcoming its poor native solubility, enhancing bioavailability, potentially facilitating CNS delivery in the case of PEA, and adding synergistic benefits by combining with agents like luteolin or ALA to specifically target additional aspects of complex pathologies, such as oxidative stress alongside inflammation.
Now let's perform that crucial comparative assessment of the strength of the scientific evidence across each of these clinical areas, based solely on the source material reviewed. This is vital for providing clear guidance and understanding where the data currently stands for medical professionals considering PEA. Where is the evidence strongest, and where is it still clearly developing?
Okay, this is critical. The strength of the clinical evidence varies significantly across these different applications, and understanding this variance is key for both guiding clinical consideration and directing future research efforts. Let's explicitly rate the evidence strength for each area as presented in the source thesis. Firstly, for eyesight, specifically glaucoma, the clinical evidence is rated as moderate to strong. This assessment is based on the existence of multiple published randomized controlled trials demonstrating its efficacy as an adjunctive therapy for reducing intraocular pressure, coupled with promising, albeit perhaps still developing, data supporting its neuroprotective effects on the optic nerve and visual fields. Furthermore, the mechanisms involved in enhancing aqueous outflow via GPR55 and PPRI in the eye are relatively well supported experimentally. Secondly, for olfactory function, particularly post-COVID olfactory dysfunction, the clinical evidence for the umpilate formulation, especially when combined with olfactory training, is also rated as moderate to strong. This is based on findings from several randomized controlled trials demonstrating statistically significant improvements in objective olfactory scores, and this clinical data is supported by a well-rationalized mechanistic hypothesis targeting the underlying neuroinflammation. However, we must include the caveats we discussed. Some nuances regarding the magnitude of clinically meaningful improvement over OT alone in certain analyses, and perhaps more variable efficacy reported for parosmia compared to hyposmia and anosmia. Thirdly, for respiratory inflammation. In the context of influenza and the common cold, the clinical evidence is categorized as emerging historical. We have those positive clinical trials reported from the 1970s, which serve as an encouraging historical precedent, but they clearly lack the methodological rigor and detailed mechanistic validation required by modern clinical standards. They need contemporary validation with robust trial designs. For COVID-19 lung inflammation, the evidence is similarly rated as emerging. There is strong supportive preclinical data for both PEA and the PEA-LA combination, and some promising preliminary observational clinical data, but it currently lacks the large, definitive randomized controlled trials necessary to firmly establish its efficacy for acute treatment or prophylaxis in a modern clinical setting for COVID-19 or similar severe viral respiratory illnesses. Finally, for hearing, specifically tinnitus, the clinical evidence is rated as limited emerging. While there is a sound therapeutic rationale for using the UMP-LAO combination based on targeting inflammation and oxidative stress within the auditory system, the clinical evidence currently relies heavily on ongoing or planned trials, like the TIMPA study mentioned. Published definitive results from rigorous randomized controlled trials specific to auditory applications were not available in the source material reviewed for this deep dive.
That provides a very clear and stratified landscape of the current evidence base as presented in the source. Glaucoma and post-COVID olfactory dysfunction appear to have the most established clinical basis currently, warranting stronger consideration in practice based on this data. In contrast, tinnitus and acute respiratory infections, while mechanistically plausible, are still very much in the emerging phase, awaiting the crucial results of robust, well-designed trials. This variance in evidence strength clearly highlights key areas that are ripe for future research investment.
Absolutely. That comparative assessment is crucial. And alongside considering the evidence for efficacy in these applications, it's important to consolidate what the source material consistently says about the safety and tolerability profile of PEA across all these potential uses.
What does the source material consistently report regarding PEA safety and tolerability? Is it generally considered safe?
Yes. Across all the applications and dosages studied and reviewed in the source material, PEA consistently demonstrates a remarkably favorable safety and tolerability profile. It is generally reported as being very well tolerated by patients, even when used at relatively high doses that have been tested in clinical settings, typically ranging from 600 milligrams up to 1,200 milligrams daily, and sometimes even higher, up to 1.8 grams per day or more in specific study protocols.
And side effects. Are serious adverse events common?
Serious adverse effects are reported very rarely, if at all, in the reviewed studies. The most commonly mentioned side effect, although still generally infrequent, is mild gastrointestinal discomfort, such as nausea, which is typically transient and doesn't often lead to discontinuation.
What about drug-drug interactions? This is especially important since it's often considered as an adjunctive therapy alongside other medications.
That's a key practical point. The source indicates that no major or clinically significant drug interactions have been documented in the literature reviewed. This lack of known interactions is a significant advantage for a compound that might be intended for long-term use alongside existing standard of care medications for chronic conditions like glaucoma, diabetic neuropathy, or potentially long COVID symptoms.
Any specific populations where caution is advised?
As a standard precaution for most supplements, caution is generally advised during pregnancy and breastfeeding, simply because rigorous clinical trials have typically not specifically established safety in these particular populations. Furthermore, it's worth noting that preclinical toxicology studies conducted on the micronized and ultramicronized formulations themselves have also generally shown favorable safety profiles, including assessments for genotoxicity and repeat dose oral toxicity in animals.
That consistently benign safety profile is certainly a major clinical advantage, particularly for conditions that might require long-term management or for use in populations already taking multiple medications. The source also references a final summary table, Table 8.1, for this comprehensive synthesis, doesn't it?
Yes, Table 8.1 serves as a valuable capstone for the entire review. It essentially consolidates the clinical evidence strength for each major therapeutic area we've discussed in detail: ocular, olfactory, respiratory, auditory. It links the specific PEA formulation most commonly used in studies for that indication, provides examples of trial designs or key findings reported, outlines the primary outcomes investigated, and importantly, explicitly states the overall clinical evidence rating, for example, moderate to strong, emerging, for that application, based on the source's assessment. It effectively pulls the key findings from chapters 4 through 7 into one concise overview and is essential for getting that final consolidated picture of where the evidence stands today, according to this thesis.
So we've conducted a truly thorough deep dive into the origins, the complex multi-target mechanisms, the crucial pharmaceutical formulations, and critically appraised the evidence base across several significant clinical areas for PEA, all based on this detailed academic source. Let's wrap up now with the principal findings and perhaps look towards the future.
Okay, to summarize the principal findings from this academic deep dive, palmitoylethanolamide clearly emerges as a fascinating endogenous lipid mediator with a unique biological profile. Its key mechanisms of action, particularly its engagement with PPAR via both those genomic and non-genomic pathways, its interaction with the extended endocannabinoid system leading to the entourage effect by preserving endogenous cannabinoids like AEA, its modulation of other receptors like GPR55 and TRPV1, and critically, its ability to modulate key non-neuronal cellular players like mast cells and glial cells collectively underpin its well-documented anti-inflammatory, neuroprotective, and analgesic properties observed in various preclinical models and some clinical settings.
And we've seen repeatedly how essential the pharmaceutical strategies have been. Formulations like micronized and ultramicronized PEA, the combination pollute and PELA play an absolutely critical role in improving its bioavailability, potentially targeting its effects, especially the CNS potential with PEA, and adding synergistic benefits by addressing multiple facets of complex pathologies, like oxidative stress alongside inflammation.
Precisely. And the comprehensive look at the clinical evidence starkly highlighted that the strength of support varies significantly by indication. We see moderate to strong evidence supporting its use as an adjunct therapy in glaucoma and for the umpilate formulation in post-COVID olfactory dysfunction, making these the areas where PEA, based on this source, has a more established place for clinical consideration. In contrast, its potential roles in tinnitus and in acute viral respiratory inflammation, while mechanistically plausible and supported by some historical or preclinical data, are still very much in the emerging phase. They clearly await definitive validation from rigorous modern clinical trials. And importantly, woven through all of this, the consistently favorable safety and tolerability profile across indications remains a significant clinical advantage for PEA.
So for medical professionals listening, the core implication seems to be that in areas where the evidence is more established, like adjunctive therapy in glaucoma, or for post-COVID olfactory loss, using optimized formulations like Umpil PA, represents a viable supportive therapy option to consider based on the data presented here. For other areas like tinnitus or acute respiratory infections, its use should be guided much more cautiously by the emerging research and careful individual patient assessment, acknowledging the current evidence gaps.
That is the appropriate and nuanced interpretation based on the current evidence landscape as presented in the source thesis, yes.
Despite the promising findings and the clearly growing body of research on PEA, what are the significant current research limitations and unanswered questions that this deep dive has underscored based on the source material? Where do we still need more information?
Several key gaps and limitations certainly remain, and the source implicitly or explicitly points these out. A major one is the clear need for more large-scale, rigorously designed, randomized controlled trial data for certain key indications where the evidence is currently rated as limited or emerging. This most notably includes tinnitus and other specific forms of hearing loss, and crucially, its potential role as a robust prophylactic or therapeutic agent for acute viral respiratory illnesses, requiring contemporary trials for influenza and especially COVID-19 that meet modern standards.
And what about the duration of use? Most trials seem relatively short.
That's another key point. We definitely need longer-term studies extending well beyond just a few months to confirm sustained efficacy and, just as importantly, long-term safety for chronic use across all potential applications, especially if considered for lifelong conditions like glaucoma or chronic pain. Deeper mechanistic elucidation is also still needed in certain specific contexts, really understanding the precise relative contribution of each signaling pathway, PPARs, ECS, GPRs, etc., in different tissues and different disease states, and mapping out the exact downstream signaling cascades involved.
What else remains unclear?
Optimal dosing regimens and the necessary duration of treatment are also not definitively established for all conditions or specific patient populations. We also lack sufficient head-to-head clinical trials directly comparing the relative efficacy and safety of different PEA formulations against each other. For example, micronized versus ultramicronized, or PEA alone versus PLE, for particular indications. This would be very valuable to guide clinical choice. There's also a significant need to identify and validate reliable biomarkers, perhaps blood markers or imaging markers that could help predict which patients are most likely to respond to PEA therapy or allow us to monitor therapeutic efficacy objectively over time. And finally, addressing the considerable clinical heterogeneity seen in complex conditions like tinnitus or long COVID is crucial. We need research aimed at identifying specific patient subgroups, perhaps based on underlying pathology or biomarkers that are most likely to derive significant benefit from PEA therapy, allowing for more personalized approaches.
Given these clear limitations and the remaining unanswered questions, what are the strategic recommendations for future research and development that are either proposed in the source or naturally arise from this comprehensive analysis? What should the priorities be moving forward?
The strategic path forward seems to involve several key priorities. Firstly, and most importantly, prioritizing rigorous clinical trials is absolutely essential. This means focusing resources on conducting large, well-designed, placebo-controlled, and ideally active comparator-controlled, where ethically appropriate and feasible, randomized controlled trials specifically in those areas where the definitive evidence is still lacking. As we've highlighted, this includes tinnitus, robust modern trials for viral respiratory illnesses including COVID-19, and dedicated clinical endpoint trials assessing disease progression in diabetic retinopathy. Secondly, it seems warranted to continue investigating PEA's potential in novel sensory or neuroinflammatory conditions that mechanistically align with its known biological actions. This could involve exploring its use in other types of optic neuropathies beyond glaucoma, different forms of hearing loss beyond tinnitus like noise-induced or age-related, or potentially exploring its role further in neurodegenerative diseases that have significant sensory deficits or clear neuroinflammatory components. Thirdly, ongoing research into optimizing delivery systems and perhaps developing or validating other rational combination therapies seems important. This could involve exploring novel local delivery methods like topical formulations for skin or eye conditions, or perhaps intranasal delivery targeting the olfactory system or CNS more directly. It also means conducting rigorous studies to validate the potential synergistic benefits of other combinations beyond luteolin and ALA, based on a clear understanding of the specific pathophysiology being targeted. Fourthly, a concerted effort towards developing and validating those biomarkers we mentioned is crucial for the field to move forward efficiently, enabling better patient selection and objective monitoring of treatment response. Establishing long-term observational studies and patient registries would also provide invaluable real-world evidence on the effectiveness, safety, and patterns of PEA use in chronic conditions outside the strict confines of RCTs. And finally, encouraging the standardization of research methodologies, particularly regarding outcome measures and agreed-upon definitions of clinical significance, especially in subjective fields like olfactory and auditory research, will be vital to allow for better comparison between studies and facilitate meaningful meta-analyses in the future.
So, to bring it all back to the core conclusion that seems to emerge from the source thesis, PEA presents itself as a truly compelling endogenous compound with significant potential that warrants further intensive investigation and careful development.
That is undoubtedly the overarching conclusion. Due to its remarkably favorable safety profile combined with its multifaceted mechanisms of action that address core pathological processes like inflammation, neuroprotection, and immune modulation, Palmitoylethanolamide, particularly when delivered in its optimized pharmaceutical formulations, stands out as a strong candidate for continued research and development. However, realizing its full clinical utility across these diverse potential applications and integrating it effectively and responsibly into medical practice will absolutely require sustained, rigorous research efforts aimed squarely at filling those remaining evidence gaps we've discussed today.
This detailed exploration raises a fascinating final thought. Given PEA's unique status as an endogenous molecule, its highly localized on-demand production specifically in response to injury or stress, acting as that aliomide, and its complex multi-target approach that seems to gently modulate, rather than completely block, key cellular drivers of pathology. Could PEA, perhaps in future novel formulations or even more sophisticated synergistic combinations, represent a subtle but significant paradigm shift in how we approach managing chronic inflammatory and neurodegenerative conditions?
Instead of relying solely on therapies that aim to block external signals or shut down pathways, could we be moving towards a future incorporating therapies that focus more on enhancing and restoring the body's own innate protective mechanisms and homeostatic responses? Something for you, our listener, to consider as you review this information yourself.